I never imagined my night would shift so suddenly from quiet routine to a moment I would never forget. My name is Jenna, and tonight, everything I thought I had moved past showed up right at my apartment door. When I opened it, I found my parents standing there with the kind of exhausted expression people have when they finally realize a decision they once defended has come back to destroy everything. They told me that Camilla had sold the house without warning, drained what she could, and disappeared before anyone noticed something was wrong. I stayed exactly where I was blocking the doorway, because the memory of them pushing me out of their lives 6 months ago cut through me the moment I saw their faces. Dad tried to speak in a calmer tone as if choosing the right words could erase what he had said that night. He claimed they had nowhere left to go, and asked if they could stay with me until they figured out what to do next. I looked straight at him and reminded him of the sentence he delivered while leaning against the doorway of my old bedroom. He smirked and said the words that echoed in my mind for months, "Figure it out." Hearing him now felt almost surreal, because the desperation in his voice was nothing like the certainty he once had when he pushed me away. I told them that 6 months was more than enough time for me to rebuild a life without their help, which meant I owed them nothing. I closed the door because I refused to let the people who discarded me return only when they needed something. If you want to know exactly what happened 6 months ago and how everything collapsed for them, stay with me and follow this story until the end. 6 months earlier, everything started with one decision my parents made that shifted the entire balance of our home long before I realized how permanent it would become. I had always tried to keep the peace in that house because tension never seemed to affect my sister Camilla the way it affected me. Yet I often believed things would eventually settle if I stayed quiet enough. That belief disappeared the moment Camilla announced she wanted my bedroom. Camilla had always been treated as though her preferences carried more weight than the reality the rest of us lived in. She had recently become fascinated with creating online content and claimed she needed a bigger room to film store equipment and experiment with whatever new project she believed could launch her into a different lifestyle. She stood in the kitchen explaining this grand vision to my parents with enough confidence to make it sound like a necessity. Mom reacted before I even processed what was happening, nodding as though Camilla's request had been discussed for weeks rather than seconds. Dad followed with a brief comment about how it made sense for someone working towards something bigger to have more space. Neither of them looked at me while saying it, and neither questioned what moving me out of that room would mean for me. I froze for a moment, unsure whether they were expecting me to understand or simply comply without question. Mom told me to pack my things by the end of the day because Camilla needed to move her lights in before the weekend. I stared at her, waiting for someone to acknowledge that I did not have another room or even a corner in the house that belonged to me. My voice felt small when I asked Dad where he expected me to sleep, but he responded with the same expression he used when dismissing anything he did not feel like dealing with. He glanced toward the hallway and said the exact words that stayed with me longer than any argument we ever had: "Figure it out." There was no discussion after that sentence because conversation required willingness from both sides, and my parents had already made it clear that my needs were not part of their decision. I walked back to my room with my chest tight in a way that made breathing feel like a task rather than something natural. I folded my clothes without knowing where they would end up, moved boxes that barely closed, and kept trying to convince myself that this might only last a few days. Deep down, I knew it would not. Camilla entered while I was still packing and reminded me to disconnect my chargers from the wall because she wanted to rearrange the outlets for her equipment. She said it casually, almost cheerfully, as though she had not taken the only space where I ever felt stable. I did not respond because I knew anything I said would be met with the same tone she always used when she believed she deserved something more than I did. I carried my bags to the front door without a clear destination, feeling the weight of everything I had never said, pressing harder than the handles digging into my hands. My parents barely looked up as I left, and that silence told me more about my place in their lives than any argument could have. I stepped outside because staying would have meant accepting that my comfort was disposable, and I refused to become someone who believed that about herself. I closed the door behind me with the realization that nothing about this moment was temporary. I walked away from the house with no plan except taking the next step, unaware that the next 6 months would rewrite every part of my life in ways I never expected. That night, the city felt colder than usual. I had no destination in mind as I parked near the edge of my old neighborhood and watched the streetlights shimmer across the empty pavement. For a while, I simply sat there without moving because the thought of driving anywhere else felt pointless, while the silence in my chest kept expanding in ways I could not manage. The loneliness that filled the car made the air feel strangely heavy, and I tried to breathe evenly so I would not fall apart in a place that meant nothing to me anymore. Everything around me looked familiar, yet distant enough to remind me that I had nowhere to go in that moment, and the realization left an ache that settled deeper with every passing minute. I scrolled through my contacts and hesitated because I could not think of anyone I trusted enough to reach out to while I was still trying to understand what had just happened. Eventually, I sent a few messages to people I used to talk to in school, although I already sensed that none of them would offer the kind of refuge I needed. The replies trickled in slowly, and each one sounded polite, but detached, as if I were nothing more than a delayed appointment someone hoped to reschedule indefinitely. Some said they were out of town. Others apologized for not being able to take in anyone so late, and their reasons, though understandable, sliced through whatever remained of my composure. I kept staring at the screen, long after the last response arrived, because I did not know what else to do except hold the phone tightly, as if the pressure alone could keep me together. When I finally forced myself to look away, the windows had begun to fog slightly from my uneven breaths. I wiped them with my sleeve before resting my forehead against the steering wheel while trying to convince myself that there had to be at least one person willing to hear my voice. That was when I remembered my friend Liam and how he had always carried a quiet sincerity that felt grounded, even when everything else shifted unpredictably. I had never relied on him for something this fragile, yet something in me believed he would not turn away if I told him I needed help. Calling him still required courage I did not feel, but I pressed the button anyway and listened to the ring echo through the car. He picked up before the second ring ended, and his tone softened immediately when he heard the tremor I could not hide. 15 minutes later, he parked beside me and stepped out without hesitation. He did not question why I was there or what had unfolded earlier. Instead, he opened the passenger door and waited patiently until I felt steady enough to move. His presence carried the kind of calm that made my thoughts slow down just enough for me to breathe without forcing it. When we reached his apartment, he adjusted the thermostat and handed me a blanket, before telling me that I could stay for as long as I needed. I thanked him quietly and tried to rest on the couch, although my mind kept replaying the feeling of standing alone when I should have been able to depend on the people who were supposed to care for me. The sense of abandonment lingered beneath every attempt to close my eyes, and even though the apartment felt safe, it did not erase the sting left behind. Liam noticed the tension in my posture and encouraged me to take things one step at a time, so the weight of the moment would not overwhelm me completely. He suggested I find temporary work first so I could regain some stability while figuring out what the future should look like. His words were gentle and thoughtful enough to ease the tightness in my chest, and for the first time that night, I felt a small shift inside me that hinted at the possibility of rebuilding something of my own. 3 weeks later, my life was calmer but far from settled. I had grown more accustomed to the routine I created for myself and felt the early signs of stability beginning to form, even if each day still carried a faint reminder of everything I had lost. The part-time job I found allowed me to contribute to the shared expenses at Liam's apartment, and that responsibility helped me regain a sense of dignity I had been afraid I might never feel again. There was something grounding about knowing I could carry my own weight, and although my hours were modest, the work made me feel present in my own life in a way I had not experienced for a long time. The atmosphere in the apartment had shifted during those weeks because I no longer felt like a visitor waiting for the moment I would overstay my welcome. I helped with groceries and cleaned the shared spaces after returning from work because contributing made me feel connected to the space rather than merely sheltered by it. Liam noticed the change and often encouraged me to rest more, yet I preferred keeping my hands busy because the stillness sometimes allowed my thoughts to drift toward memories I was not ready to confront. One evening, after a long shift, I sat on the couch while checking my email and noticed a subject line that made my stomach drop. The message came from the bank associated with the old family account I once had access to, and it contained a warning about unusual activity that required immediate verification. My hands tensed as I opened the details because I had not used that account since the night everything fell apart, and I could not imagine why any new transactions would appear. Several charges stood out immediately, including the creation of credit lines tied to Dad's name, although the electronic signatures looked inconsistent and strangely rushed. I showed the message to Liam, and the two of us spent nearly an hour reviewing every document the bank attached. His calm reasoning helped me slow down enough to analyze each detail rather than panic at the sight of unfamiliar charges. The inconsistencies became clearer with every file we compared, and something about the formatting suggested that whoever authorized those accounts had either ignored standard procedures or tried to move quickly before anyone noticed. A heaviness settled in my chest as I scrolled through the pages because the situation felt deliberate instead of accidental. Liam suggested we document everything so I could address it properly once I understood the legal framework behind these kinds of transactions. The next day, I visited the community library after work and found a quiet corner near the back where I could concentrate. I searched for information on signature verification, credit line authorization, and the process used to challenge fraudulent activity in family-linked accounts. The more I read, the more uneasy I felt because a pattern emerged that pointed toward manipulation rather than harmless oversight. Some of the examples described methods used to falsify digital signatures in ways that aligned too closely with the irregularities we noticed, and the resemblance made my pulse quicken. Late that afternoon, my phone vibrated with a message from Camilla, and her words were so abrupt that I stared at the screen for several seconds before fully processing them. She wrote only, "Don't talk about anything." The vagueness of the warning unsettled me because she rarely contacted me without a specific purpose, and the timing felt too precise to ignore. I tried reading it again in case I had misinterpreted the tone, yet the message remained sharp enough to confirm that something was undeniably wrong. As I walked back to the apartment under the fading light, a suspicion formed quietly in my thoughts and refused to loosen its grip. I had no proof that Camilla was connected to the suspicious transactions, but her sudden message made the possibility difficult to dismiss. I needed clarity before confronting her, and I promised myself I would gather every piece of information necessary to understand why those accounts had been tampered with and who truly stood behind the signatures that did not belong to the person they claimed to represent. A month later, the first real warning arrived in the mail. I had been sorting through the evening deliveries at Liam's apartment when I noticed an envelope forwarded from my old address, and the moment I saw the bank's logo on the corner, a chill swept through me that I could not explain. The letter contained a formal notice about an overdue mortgage payment connected to the family home, and the language they used made it clear that the issue had been ongoing for longer than I realized. My pulse quickened as I read each paragraph because it was no longer a matter of isolated credit irregularities. This warning suggested that something had been put in motion long before I discovered the suspicious transactions, and the weight of that realization settled heavily across my shoulders. I sat at the kitchen table for several minutes while attempting to process the implications. There was no reason for the mortgage to fall into delinquency unless someone had been withholding payments, redirecting funds, or manipulating the account in ways I had not yet uncovered. The uncertainty made it difficult to sit still, and after gathering the documents from the envelope, I returned to the community library to examine the files I had saved during my previous searches. The quiet atmosphere helped me focus, and shortly after logging into the public computer, I found the valuation records linked to the property. Several digital signatures stood out immediately, and although they were labeled under Dad's name, I recognized the same inconsistencies I had noted in the earlier credit files. The strokes were unnaturally smooth, the pressure patterns were uniform, and the timestamps suggested they had been executed within seconds of each other. My heart sank, because this pattern could not be dismissed as coincidence. Someone had been forging documents systematically, and the scale of the fabrication felt much larger than I initially assumed. I printed the relevant pages and placed them carefully into a folder before making my way to a small cafe nearby so I could review them without feeling rushed. Despite reading each line multiple times, the sense of unease continued to grow because the implications extended far beyond personal inconvenience. If the signatures had been used to authorize mortgage-related transactions, the consequences could involve foreclosure or a forced sale, neither of which could be undone easily. That evening, I visited Mom and Dad with the intention of warning them before the situation worsened. The conversation deteriorated quickly because they refused to believe that any of the documents could be forged. Mom insisted that I had misunderstood the bank's notice, and Dad dismissed everything as unnecessary worry, while assuring me that Camilla would never engage in anything questionable. Their refusal to consider the possibility left me rattled, because their denial did not match the severity of the evidence I had collected. The conversation ended abruptly, and I walked out of the house with an ache that tightened in my chest. Later that night, Camilla vanished from social media, and every message I sent remained unanswered. Her sudden absence felt deliberate rather than coincidental, as if she had anticipated the fallout before anyone else realized there was something to hide. The timing unsettled me deeply because she had never withdrawn so completely without an explanation, and I sensed that whatever had been set in motion was beginning to accelerate beyond my control. When I returned to the apartment, Liam listened carefully as I explained what happened. He urged me to document everything more thoroughly, because the situation involved potential charges related to identity misuse and falsified financial records. His calm reasoning helped stabilize my thoughts enough for me to focus, and I spent the rest of the night organizing the files into chronological order so the pattern of inconsistencies would be easier to demonstrate. By the time I finished sorting through the digital folders, it became clear that the issue extended into preliminary filings for a property sale. Each document pointed toward a coordinated effort to move the house toward liquidation, using signatures that the real account holder had never provided. The realization carried a weight that made the room feel smaller, and I understood that I was stepping into a situation far more dangerous than I had expected when I first noticed the unusual transactions. 6 weeks later, everything collapsed at once. I learned about the foreclosure notice when I returned to the neighborhood and saw a bright sticker plastered across the front door of the house where I had grown up, and the stark lettering confirmed that the property had been seized due to months of unpaid mortgage debt. The yard looked strangely abandoned, and the windows no longer resembled the place that once held every memory of my childhood. I stood on the walkway for a long moment while trying to grasp the reality that the home had moved past the point of rescue, and although I expected something to unravel eventually, I had not imagined that the collapse would arrive with such force. Mom and Dad were already outside when I approached, and their voices rose sharply as they argued over who had approved the documents that initiated the process. Mom insisted that she had never signed anything related to a sale, while Dad accused her of overlooking important notices, although neither of them realized that Camilla had forged both signatures to accelerate the transaction. Their confusion grew louder with each accusation, and the tension between them made the entire scene feel surreal, as if the truth had been scattered too far for either of them to reach. I stayed several steps away because there was nothing I could say that they were willing to hear. Every warning I had offered in the past had been dismissed, and standing closer would only invite another round of denial I no longer had the energy to endure. Their voices carried across the yard in a way that reminded me of every moment they had refused to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation, and although I felt a faint ache watching them unravel, I knew that stepping in would not change anything. Liam joined me a moment later and placed a quiet reassurance into the space between us by telling me that it was best to leave before their anger turned toward me. I appreciated the steadiness in his voice because the chaos unfolding near the porch was beginning to feel overwhelming, and I sensed that if I lingered any longer, I would be pulled into the storm they had created. He waited until I nodded before guiding me back toward the sidewalk so I could distance myself from the turmoil that had consumed the family home. As we walked past the corner of the street, police vehicles approached the property. The officers stepped out with files in hand while requesting information from Mom and Dad regarding irregularities found in the property transfer documents. Their posture suggested that the investigation had already progressed significantly, and the presence of law enforcement added a heavy finality to a situation that had begun as a quiet suspicion in my inbox weeks earlier. I felt a weight settle across my chest as I watched from a distance because the reality of what had been set in motion could no longer be softened by denial or excuses. Mom called out my name once she noticed me standing farther down the street, and Dad followed her gaze with a frantic expression that revealed more fear than anger. I turned away because I understood that any attempt to involve me at this stage would only drag me deeper into consequences I had fought tirelessly to prevent. They had ignored every warning I brought to them, and I realized that stepping back was the only way to protect myself from the fallout they now had to confront. Liam remained beside me as we continued down the sidewalk, and I kept my focus forward so I would not be tempted to turn back. The investigation into the fraudulent transfer would determine what happened next, and although I carried a quiet sadness for everything that had been lost, I also recognized the importance of choosing distance over responsibility for actions that had never belonged to me. Now everything has come full circle. I realized that truth most clearly on a quiet morning when someone knocked on my apartment door with a hesitant rhythm that suggested fear rather than impatience. And the moment I opened it, I saw Mom and Dad standing together in a way I had never witnessed before. Their clothes looked worn from days of searching for temporary accommodations, and the exhaustion in their eyes made it clear that the foreclosure had pushed them far beyond anything they had prepared for. They explained that every rental agency had rejected their applications because their credit scores had been flagged as high risk after the fraud investigation began, and the situation left them with nowhere safe to go. Dad attempted to speak first, and his voice carried a forced calm that could not conceal the desperation beneath. He tried to appeal to the idea of family as though invoking a shared bond would erase the years of imbalance that shaped our relationship. He said that families should look after one another, and that difficult times required unity, but the words sounded strangely hollow, as if he no longer believed them himself. When he paused, expecting sympathy, I repeated the same phrase he once used on me when I begged for help. Figure it out. Those 3 words fell between us with a weight that signaled the end of every unspoken hope they still carried. Silence stretched across the hallway, and their expressions changed from pleading to disbelief. Although part of me understood the pain behind their eyes, I also knew that opening the door any wider would invite the return of patterns that had harmed me for years. I steadied my breath before closing the door because the decision felt like the only way to protect the progress I had made since leaving the house that had shaped so much of my past. The soft click of the lock seemed to echo longer than expected, but the sense of clarity that followed helped me remain steady. Later that afternoon, I learned through neighbors that Mom and Dad had visited the local police station for guidance. Officers directed them toward a shelter that specialized in supporting individuals facing sudden displacement, and although the thought of them staying there stirred a quiet ache in me, I also recognized that every choice they made had carried consequences they refused to face, until the weight of those decisions collapsed beneath them. The shelter offered temporary stability, and it was the safest option available while the investigation continued. Meanwhile, Camilla became an official subject of inquiry for her involvement in the forged documents. The authorities had traced several signatures across multiple filings, and the evidence indicated a pattern of deliberate falsification rather than an isolated mistake. Hearing that update left me with a complicated mix of disappointment and acceptance, because I had held on to a fragile hope that she might confront the truth earlier, yet even that hope had dissolved under the pressure of everything uncovered. Although I felt no satisfaction in her arrest, I understood that accountability had finally appeared in a form she could no longer avoid. That evening, Liam and I sat together at the small dining table in the apartment while discussing the future we wanted to create. He reminded me that moving forward required us to set boundaries strong enough to protect the life we were building, and the thought of shaping something stable without the shadow of old wounds brought a sense of calm I had not felt in years. We spoke quietly about the possibility of relocating to a quieter neighborhood, pursuing new work opportunities, and establishing routines that reflected who we were becoming rather than who we had been forced to be. His patience grounded me, and the warmth of his presence made it easier to see that distance from harmful relationships did not equal cruelty, but self-preservation. When the conversation ended, I stepped onto the balcony for fresh air, and the city lights flickered across the skyline like reminders of the paths I had taken to reach this moment. For the first time, the past no longer felt like a weight pressing against my spine. Instead, it felt like a door I had finally learned to close without looking back. Life looks different now, and thankfully, in the best possible way. I often think about how unfamiliar this piece would have felt a year earlier, yet it has now become the rhythm that carries me through each day, with a steadiness I once believed I would never experience. My world no longer revolves around anticipating the next conflict or bracing myself for the emotional eruptions that used to fill the house where I grew up. Instead, my life has expanded into something healthier, quieter, and guided by choices that belong entirely to me. My new job played a major role in that transformation. When I first started, I approached every task with a determination shaped by years of feeling unseen, and that determination slowly shifted into confidence as my responsibilities grew. After several months of consistent effort, I received a promotion that validated everything I had worked so hard to rebuild. The recognition felt meaningful, not because of the title, but because it proved I could shape a future without being weighed down by expectations that never served me. Each morning, I walk into the office with the calm assurance that I am building something stable, and that feeling has grounded me in ways I had not thought possible during the period when my life felt tangled in family chaos. Amid that stability, something even more significant happened. One evening, while we were preparing dinner together in the small kitchen of our apartment, Liam paused as if gathering courage for a moment he had been rehearsing alone. He asked me to marry him with a sincerity that softened every remaining corner of doubt in my heart, and the proposal felt warm rather than dramatic. There was no elaborate gesture, just honesty and affection, which made me realize that sharing a future with him felt like the most natural decision I could ever make. I said yes because he had shown me from the beginning what it meant to be loved, without conditions or manipulation. Meanwhile, the situation with Camilla reached a formal resolution. The court placed her on probation and ordered her to compensate Mom and Dad for the financial loss they suffered. The judgment acknowledged the harm she caused without tearing her life apart entirely, and although the outcome could not undo the damage, it at least established accountability. I observed the news from a distance, feeling neither vindictive nor forgiving, simply aware that the consequences had caught up in a way that reflected the truth. It was not my role to interfere, and for the first time I felt completely detached from the tangled loyalties that once dictated my every move. Mom and Dad continued living in the shelter as they worked through the financial obligations that grew heavier over time. Reports from distant relatives suggested that they struggled to adjust to the reality of reduced independence, yet they had little choice but to confront the results of the decisions they had ignored for too long. I no longer followed their situation closely because maintaining that distance allowed me to protect the quiet I had fought to create. The past remained a closed chapter, and keeping it closed became essential for my emotional well-being. With each passing day, I learned to release the idea that family bonds must be preserved at any cost. I chose instead to keep only the people who offered kindness, understanding, and sincerity, and the absence of chaos allowed those connections to flourish. I no longer felt guilty for drawing boundaries, and the freedom that followed became one of the most valuable parts of my new life. As I look ahead, I carry a simple truth with me. Family is not defined by blood or obligation, but by the people who choose to stay when everything around you is falling apart. Those who remain through the lowest moments are the ones who deserve a place in your future, and recognizing that has allowed me to walk forward with clarity rather than fear. The greatest lesson I have taken from this journey is that healing requires distance from the people who continually break the parts of you they refuse to acknowledge. Choosing yourself is not selfish but necessary when your stability depends on stepping away from harmful patterns. Life becomes far more meaningful when you surround yourself with those who respect your boundaries, support your growth, and treat you with the consistency you were denied for so long. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and for giving your time to a journey that demanded courage and honesty. If any part of my experience resonates with your own life, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments and let me know which moment spoke to you the most, because your voice adds meaning to every story told here.